So something that I want to discuss with you about behavioral change research is, I would say, key concepts that I will use throughout my presentation. First, what is research? What is behavior? What is behavioral change? And what is behavioral change research? Um, so when it comes to research, I think it is important to highlight the difference between research, academic research, and applied research. So as you know, research is a way of knowing by producing new knowledge. And I want to highlight this because many times when we want to do or we want to know something, we may or may not need to do a research. In fact, I have seen many people having research questions that you don't need to do research to answer those questions. Just need to go to the literature and read carefully what have been already documented. So every time you want to do a research and you have a question, the first question you have to ask yourself is whether or not you need to do a research to address that question. If there is no knowledge that answer that question, then you may need to do research. And coming from the academia, the kind of research that I do, we call academic research, which is intended to fill a gap in the literature. And there is another kind of research we call applied research, in which you produce new knowledge to address a problem, a social problem, or a relevant problem. It could be organizational problem, community problem, or social problem in general. And that's the kind of research that you are planning to do. When I look at your research proposal, I notice right away that you are planning to focus on relevant social problems like pollution, birth control, organ donation, food waste, all those things. So this is not academic research, it is more applied research. You will produce new knowledge to address existing relevant problems. Is that distinction clear?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So what is behavior? I think this is a very general definition of behavior. So it's an action or activity. And there is another important definition I wanna highlight, which is behavioral categories and behavioral goal. So a behavior is an action, is an activity. A behavioral category is a class of behavior, like a physical activity is a behavioral category. It's not a behavior. Dietary behavior is a category of behavior. And so behavioral goal is something that you want to achieve by performing behavior. The reason why I want to highlight the difference between the two is because intervention are more likely to be successful if they focus on a specific behavior rather than on behavioral categories. So when you want to facilitate a behavioral change, you have to target specific behavior, because category of behavior like a physical activity encompasses many types of behavior. Some of those behavior, for example, are habits, and the way that you change habit is quite different from when you want people to adopt a new behavior. So I think the key message here is when it comes to behavioral change, you should define a specific behavior as opposed to a behavioral category or a behavioral goal. So the definition of behavioral change is a set of coordinated activity that we design to promote behavioral change. And it is important to also stress that behavioral change is not equal to improvement. Sometimes we change things that do not improve anything. So that's a very important decision, because when we talk about behavioral change, it's not the change per se what matters, is the extent to which that change will improve something. So behavioral change research, which is the topic of my presentation today, is a research that aims to, it could inform behavioral change intervention. It could evaluate the outcome of behavioral change intervention that have been implemented. Or it can also be used, research can also be used to explain why an intervention worked or why that intervention didn't work. So today I will talk about research informing behavioral change intervention and research that you can use to evaluate those interventions. every time we talk about behavioral change research, we are thinking of a research that it is done at group, community, and societal level. So we don't do research, for example, if a clinician wants to change a behavior or facilitate a behavioral change in a patient. So we don't do, he or she would not do research. He or she will use some tools, perhaps some survey to collect data about to determine what needs to be changed, but that would not be a formal research. So when we talk about behavioral change research, we're talking about behavioral change that are expected to be done at group, community, organization, and societal level. And your research proposal, when I read them, I remember in some cases it was an age group that was targeted. That's the kind of behavioral change research that we focus on. So this is, so after reading the literature about behavioral change and different models, I came up with this very straightforward model of behavioral change. So for me, if you want to change a behavior in a group or in a community or in an organization and you want to do a research, there are a number of steps you have to go through. First, you have to define the specific behavior or behaviors you want to change. Then you will identify what I call the behavior target. So let's assume you want to change this behavior. That's the first phase. In the second phase, you will determine the things that need to be changed to change that behavior or the determinant of the behavior that you want to change. Then you will use, let's say, once you have determined the behavior and the things you have to change that behavior. So you will use, or I think the idea is to use a proper approach and technique to change that that component of the behavior. I will give you an example. Let's say that the behavior has to do with organ donation, and you identify that the reason why people are not expressing their will to donate organs is because they lack of knowledge or lack of attitude. Then if you target attitudes or you want to change the attitude, you have to use a proper approach and technique to change the attitude. That would be the third phase of the behavioral change process. And at the end, of course, you will evaluate the impact of your intervention, whether or not your intervention to change that attitude was effective. That's pretty much a very general model, but I think it is straightforward and it is applicable to any behavioral change process. So when it comes to defining the behavior, which is the first thing we should do, and I noticed that in your research proposal, the behaviors um, that you were planning to change were not well defined. So there are four things you have to take into consideration to properly define a behavior. So you have to define the action, the target, the context, and the time. So for example, I have here expressing, that would be the action, the willingness to donate personal organs, that would be the target, that's what you want to, that's the behavior, and the context where that behavior happened and the time. So you would say the way that I will define this behavior will be expressing the willingness to donate personal organs in a donation card or form before death. That would be a definition that includes all the key components that you should keep in mind to define behavior. And this is another example. Uh, Flossing teeth at home once a day after supper for the next 6 months. When behavioral scientists talk about behavior, we're talking about at this level of definition. Because it's one of these elements change, we are talking about a different behavior right away. Guille, I don't know if we have time to kind of, if a student wants to define a behavior, maybe later on they will do it. But this is an exercise you can do after this presentation. So ask a student to define, or they can send a definition of behavior to me, and I will provide them with some feedback.
That will be great. Yeah, but even
Yeah.
I think that this model helps them to start thinking about the behavior in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the first step is to properly define a behavior, and you have to take into consideration all these components. If you change one of those components, we will talk about a different behavior right away. And that's what I try to show in this slide. So let's say walking 30 minutes 3 times a week for the next 6 months. That's a behavior. Then this behavior is different if you change the action, which is running 30 minutes 3 times a week for the next 6 months. It is not just a matter of definition. The factor that may play a role in whether people will walk 30 minutes or run 30 minutes may be quite different. For example, walking 30 minutes 3 times a week, maybe the main issue for not doing so may be motivation or lack of motivation. But if you talk about running the same amount of time, maybe have to do with motivation or some barrier that people experience to run. So it's just changing the action, you will change the behavior, and potentially the determinant of those behavior will be different. So that's the whole point about defining behavior properly. It should be a specific behavior, should not be category of behavior or behavioral goals, as I mentioned before. So there are different sources of information about the behavior we may target. So if you want to promote behavioral changes, you have to identify those behaviors, you have to define them, but you have to look at proper source of information about the behaviors that need to be changed. And that's what I want to stress here. So there are a number of sources of information. You can see them here, and research is one of them. You can do research to identify behavior, or through research, we identify behavior that needs to be changed. But if you look at some report, the literature, you will soon realize that people have talked about behavioral change that need to be promoted. The whole point here is that for us to claim that there is a behavior that needs to be changed, we have to have high quality data and sufficient data to claim so. And this is critically important because when I read your research proposal at some point, so you are a student, I understand that, but I'm talking ideally for you to claim that this behavioral change is needed, you have to have enough information and high quality information. Otherwise, if your proposal would be as or evaluated by a committee, and that committee will decide whether or not will approve your research proposal, if you don't provide enough information about the need for making those specific changes, your proposal will not be approved. So then we move to the second phase. So now we know we have identified, let's say, a behavior we want to change. That's our target behavior. In the second phase, we will identify the things that we need to change that behavior. And you have to perform kind of an analysis of those potential determinants of your target behavior. And then when you identify some potential determinant, in many cases, we have to decide which determinant we will focus on. Let's say I will give you an example. If organ donation, the reason why people are not expressing their willingness to donate organ have to do with lack of knowledge, have to do with attitude, has to do with, I would say, skills or something, you may be able to act or to influence attitude, but not perhaps skills. If that's the case, that's what you do here. So you identify the determinant of the behavior, and then you assess how much control you have over those determinants. And you will focus on the determinants that are influential, and at the same time, you have control over. If you pick something that you cannot modify, what's the point of conducting a behavioral change process? So you identify the factor that you need to change, and then you assess or you focus on the factor that you can feasibly change with the resources you have. So when you want to identify the determinant of the behavior, something that I always suggest is to do it by using a behavioral change theory. So if the behavior you want to change is a habit, so you should learn about habitual behavior. So those theory will inform you about the potential factor shaping habits. And so this is what you do here. So you want to identify the determinant of your target behavior, and you should use a behavioral theory. So this is a behavioral theory that I am very familiar with, and the people are using this day a lot because this model integrate previous theory. And what this model suggests, it's first of all, you have to know what models were developed for. So this is not a model that was developed to explain a habitual behavior. It's a model that was suggested to inform or to explain behaviors that you want to adopt. So new behaviors. So you see, according to this model, there are, I would say, 6 potential factors determining a behavior. First of all, a behavior will be performed if you have the knowledge and skills, if you have the intention or motivation, and if you don't face any major barrier to perform the behavior. And then if you don't have intention, the lack of intention can be explained by attitude, perceived norm, and self-efficacy, which is the perceived ability to perform the behavior. So I will kind of um, describe quickly the main tenets of this behavioral approach that you can use to inform the behavioral change you want to promote in your research project. And some of you that are dealing with behavior in other contexts, so is the behavior you're dealing with is something that people have to adopt, you may need to use this kind of model to inform your data collection process about the things that need to be changed to change those behavior. So for example, according to this model, as I mentioned before, people will perform a behavior if they want to perform the behavior, if they know how to perform the behavior, and if they can to perform the behavior. So can mean that they don't face major barriers. If, according to this model, if you have the motivation to perform a behavior, but you don't act upon that motivation, then it may be because you don't know how to perform the behavior. It has to do with skill or knowledge, or maybe you are facing barrier preventing you from performing those behavior. That's the rationale behind this model. And if you don't have the intention or the motivation to perform the behavior, maybe it's because an attitude, lack of attitude, or unfavorable attitude toward performing the behavior, which is quite common, or normative reason. Normative reason has to do with the extent to which the behavior is aligned with the norm that you have learned, or to what extent what you do is aligned with the things that your reference group do. And then it could also, people may not be motivated to change a behavior because they don't feel capable. And this is one of the strongest determinant of behavioral performance and motivation. If you don't feel capable of performing a behavior, you will not be motivated and you will not perform the behavior. The most important point here is that you have to develop different intervention depending on whether the intention wasn't formed. And remember, something I want to stress here is if people are not motivated, in some cases it's because they don't have a positive attitude. In some cases, it has to do with social norms or normative issues, and in some cases, it has to do with self-efficacy. You have to determine which of these factors is determining the lack of motivation. Maybe more than one is attitude, lack of self-efficacy, or confidence in performing the behavior. But you should not assume that if someone doesn't have or is not motivated, it is because lack of attitude. Only the data will tell you what is the factor playing a role in that lack of motivation. So once you have decided this is a model that I will use or will inform my data collection about which factor are determining this behavior. So you collect data to know what those factors are. This what I show you here is that if you use the integrative model of behavioral change, so you have to collect data about these factors. You have to collect data about skills, barrier, intention, attitude, norms, self-efficacy, and so on. And you have to collect sufficient and high quality data to be able to determine whether people they don't perform the behavior because they don't have the motivation, or because they don't have the skills, or because they are facing barrier. And if they don't have the motivation, why they don't have the motivation. So with that information, you will be able to identify the things that you have to change the behavior. Is that clear so far?
From my side, yeah.
Okay. So I know you have your microphone off, but at some point I will kind of ask those kind of questions just to check whether you are
Yeah. Yeah.
understanding. Yeah. Okay. So first we
Quick
identify
question.
behavior, and then
Just
we have
a
to
brief question.
identify the. Okay.
You mentioned here validated tools and interview protocols, right? How do you validate these?
You're talking about this slide or the previous one?
No, this one here.
Yeah. So I think my point is, once you say, okay, I will identify or try to identify the things that have to change the behavior, you should use validated tool to be able to gather high quality data. So there are a number of tools. I am impressed about how many people attempt to develop new tools instead of just looking at the literature or even talking to some expert in those area, and they will tell you right away validated tools that have been used for the same purpose. So people, this is very interesting question, because some people, they understand research as something that you have to do everything. So if you don't develop a survey, you're not doing research. So the novelty or originality of your research in many cases doesn't rely on developing a new data collection strategy. In fact, I would say in many cases it is not needed. So if there is a validated tool, use that tool. And if you want to develop a tool, you should validate that tool. And there are very well established approaches about how to validate tools. Even, for example, if your data collection about the things you have to change your target behavior is informed by this model. So if you want to collect data through interview, that's something that I do very often. There are approaches about how to develop an interview protocol. Most people, they don't know. They just have a bunch of questions. But those approaches, for example, how to develop a protocol, an interview protocol for a focus group, we tell you what kind of question you should have, the order or the sequence of those questions, and it's a lot of things, a lot of technicality and methodological issues that people have to take into consideration when developing an interview guide. It's not just some question that I think I should ask my to participant. So that's what I try to stress here. So your interview, let's say you want to collect data through an interview, that interview should be informed by a theory or a model about the nature of the behavior you are dealing with. If you are dealing with a habit, a theory about habit will tell you what kind of factor may explain the performance of those habits or not. If you are talking about an addictive behavior, there are models that will tell you what are the potential factors.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is, once you collect the data, I would say you will likely find, according to this model, these three main scenarios. So for example, you may find that individual don't act upon their intention. So they have the motivation, but they don't act upon their motivation. If that's the case, potential determinant will be, and these are the things that you will target in your intervention, maybe lack of skills or presence of barrier. So you would do an intervention intended to, let's say, remove some barrier, or at least to help to remove those barriers. If the individual have not formed the intention, so there are a number of things, as I mentioned before, that may explain that. They may not have a positive attitude toward the behavior. They think that the behavior is not aligned with what the reference group think about performing that behavior, or maybe they don't feel capable of performing those behaviors. If they don't have the attitude and they don't act upon their intention. So there are a number of things that you need to change. So that would be the focus of your intervention. So based on this scenario, you can identify the things that you need to change, and then you will determine which of those things. Let's assume that, for example, if that group is capable of performing the behavior, has the skill, the knowledge, and that group is not facing major barriers. So it is a problem of lack of motivation. But then you collect the data and you basically, or you identify that the main problems, for you to change the behavior, you have to focus on attitude and self-efficacy. But then, or normative issues, but then you may not be able to change all those things. It would not feasible for you to change those things, and you may decide to focus on changing attitude. That's how it works. So you identify what need to be changed to change the behavior. And let's say there are 3 things you may need to change, but you may not be able to change all those 3 things. Then you will focus on the things that you will feasibly change or likely change. That's the whole point about phase 2. So then, let's say that after you define the behavior, you determine the factor that you need to change that behavior, and you focus on those that you can feasibly change. Then you have to choose a proper approach and proper technique to change that behavior. For example, if the main issue is that people have not the skills, one of the approach you can use is training. So, for example, this is something that I see very often, that people identify that participant or the target population is not performing the behavior because they don't have the knowledge or they don't have the skills, and then they use persuasion. They try to persuade them about the value of performing the behavior. So that is not an approach to address the lack of skills, because persuasion is not meant to improve skills. Skills are improved by practicing those actions. So it should be a consistency between the what you want to change and the intervention approach you should choose. So this is something that you can look at these tables. There's a couple of tables that I developed for this presentation. But you can see, for example, if people are not acting upon the behavior, it may be according to the model that we have discussed already, because they don't have the skills. And then maybe the proper approach could be training. And then you should use a proper technique, training skills to enhance those skills. The problem with many interventions, first, they don't identify target behavior properly, or they may not use a proper approach in their intervention. And if they decide to train, let's say if the lack of skills and training is the way to go, they may not use proper training skills. So I have it here, I think at some point, for example, positive feedback. In some cases, we don't need to change a behavior, but just to maintain the behavior that has been already changed. In a lot of, I would say, in clinical setting, and so in many cases, once the patient has already changed the behavior, we just need to support them. And one of the things we do, one of the approach is to provide positive feedback about the things that I'm doing. And many people, they may approach that behavioral change properly, but the technique that they use to provide positive feedback is not appropriate. They do it based on common sense. And it's the same with persuasion that I mentioned before. Sometimes persuasion is the way to go, is the proper approach, but the persuasion technique that people use are not appropriate. So that's what I mean by using proper approach and proper technique. So otherwise, you will not be able to change what you need to change to change the behavior.
Arnaldo, can you give an example of positive feedback? Could be in obesity if you want.
So what I have here is, so it's the idea of you want to support a behavioral change that have already occurred. And you say, okay, I have different options. different approaches. For example, support keeping. So sometimes we support people to perform the behavior, and we know if we remove that support, people may fall back into previous habits. Or we say, okay, the approach, what is feasible here is to provide them with feedback and to boost their motivation. So what I'm telling here is that if you want to provide feedback, there are some models about how to provide feedback. And this is what I have here. So if you want to provide positive feedback, first of all, you have to highlight what is the goal. So let's say that you want to perform a behavior. What is the goal of performing that behavior? You have to stress that. When it comes to performance, let's say, so you have to identify the goal, then you have to say where you are. And in many cases, when people try to provide feedback, they don't tell in their feedback, they don't tell the action needed to achieve the goal. So that part of the feedback is missing. And that's the reason why many people don't provide. And for example, I deal with a lot of instructors, and they provide feedback to students, medical student or clinical student, when they are providing care, and their feedback pretty much focus on the things that they didn't do well. So according to proper model of feedback, when you want to provide feedback about student performance, you have to clarify the goal. What would be the ideal performance? That would be the goal. Where you are, and what specific thing you need to do to achieve that level of performance. So my point, once again, is many times people say, oh, persuasion doesn't work, or training didn't work. So it's not like training didn't work, it's that you did not use proper training technique. Or persuasion may work, but you did not use any model of persuasion to persuade people about changing something. That's what the point that I want to make. So this is similar. So this is the scenario, the possible intervention approach according to this scenario. And I did not kind of highlight. I would be crazy if I have a column of all the techniques you can use to, let's say, to persuade people or to modeling. I just want to stress the idea that you have to use proper approaches and technique. So what are, I don't know how much time I have been talking, but I want also to highlight a few things I call intervention pitfall. And the first, I think we have already discussed, is people usually, they don't follow any formal process when it comes to behavioral change. And they assume something, that the reason why people are not performing the behavior is this, and then they come up with an intervention which is not theoretical driven. So what I want to highlight is that you will maximize the possibility of changing behavior if you follow a formal process. If you identify a behavior, if you identify the determinant of those behavior, if you target the behavior the determinant of the behavior that you can feasibly change, if you use a proper approach, and if you use a proper technique. So there is a formal process you need to follow. Another common pitfall is that intervention, behavioral change intervention, many of them are not theoretically informed. And as I mentioned before, theoretically informed intervention are more likely to be effective compared to common sense intervention. That has been well demonstrated. So that's what I want your student to keep in mind. If they want to change something, they should use some models to guide their intervention process. So another common pitfall is that when people want to change behavior, they focus on the need for change. So for example, if you increase the perceived or the awareness of a disease, for example, people may be motivated to change, but it doesn't mean that they will be motivated to change specific behavior. And what the research have shown is that if you want to change behavior, you have to focus on the motivation to perform the behavior as opposed to the motivation to change in general. And that's what many intervention falls, because they kind of increase the motivation for change, but ultimately it comes to whether you are motivated to perform specific behaviors. So this is another pitfall. I would say, don't assume why people don't perform the behavior. Gather high quality data and you will identify why they perform, why they don't perform those behaviors. Never assume, because the determinant of a behavior may change by group. So a group of people may not perform the behavior because of attitude, and the same behavior, all the group may not perform the same behavior because of social norms, for example. So don't assume why people don't do things. Gather data, analyze the data, and you will determine those factors you have to focus on. And I think being consistent when it comes to behavioral change is another pitfall. Some people, they target behavior, but the intervention approach is not appropriate. So what else I have here? I think that I already have talked about it. So then once you have identified the behavior, the determinant of the behavior that you want to change, you use a proper approach and technique to change those determinants, then you will evaluate, you are expected to evaluate the impact of your intervention. I just have it's complicated, the evaluation of intervention, and a lot of behavioral change research focus on evaluating behavioral change intervention, and they use quantitative research, qualitative research, or mixed method, and they focus on what we call formative evaluations, evaluation throughout the process, or summative evaluation is at the end when you evaluate the result against your expected outcome. You can determine to what extent the intervention achieved the result that you expected. This is a very interesting area of research that I just kind of highlight, but that would be the last phase of an intervention process. You are supposed to evaluate the extent to which the intervention you implemented was effective. So how much time I have? Now I'm moving to some of the, so I know I still have some questions. So
Shall we move into the questions, Arnaldo, to see? I think that now they have gathered more information.
Yeah, so we can have some questions, and then I will talk a little bit about the research proposal that I read. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. So who have questions? Yana, Dominique.
Actually, I used it's kind of half of the framework you presented. It's called Planned Behavior from Eisen, I guess.
Yep.
And I had kind of difficulties because I wanted to use this framework in order to evaluate my interviews and to kind of categorize it for these like attitudes, subjective norm, all these. But I had a bit of an issue in actually defining the behavior that should come out. So is the behavior discussing and engaging in a discussion about organ donation, or is it gaining knowledge, or do I have to then take two frameworks and do it twice? For the first action is actually engaging with the topic, and then the second one is building knowledge. So that was kind of, or if that goes like hand in hand.
So the model that I just described to you is meant to it's more encompassing, because the theory of planned behavior explains a behavior, assuming that you already know the behavior you want to change. So what you are struggling with is, to some extent, that you don't know how to define the behavior you want to focus on.
Yeah.
And that's the first step. For example, whether the behavior you want to change is to formally expressing your willingness to donate organs. That's what's your project?
It's actually in how becoming active. Yeah, how the increase of knowledge could increase the likelihood of taking action.
Expressing
Yeah,
that desire in a formal way.
Yeah.
So, but first you have to determine the behavior. In this case, it's not discussing about donation, it's expressing your willingness to donate organs. Then that's your behavior. Then that's the first phase. The second phase would be to, you know, that many individuals, as you described in the background information that I read, many individuals, they don't express or formally express that they want to donate their organs. And that's a problem, because unless they formally express that willingness, you cannot use their organs.
Yeah.
When you are there, you have to find the behavior. You say, okay, what may explain that they are not formally expressing their willingness to donate organs? And then you use a theory. In this case, it's not a habit. It's a kind of behavior you want them to perform. So you can use the theory of planned behavior to inform your data collection about potential determinant of not expressing your willingness to donate organs. When you use that model, you may identify, once you collect data informed by that model, you may identify or recognize that the main issue is that they have not the motivation or the intention to do it. Or maybe they are facing some barriers. Or maybe it's a matter of attitude. And let's assume if it is a matter of attitude, you have the behavior, the theory of planned behavior that happened with many theory explain potential determinant of behavior. Those theory don't tell you how to address those issues. So if there is a matter of attitude, that behavior doesn't tell you how to address an unfavorable attitude. There are other theory about attitudinal change that you have to review for you to design your intervention. That's how things work.
Yeah.
So that theory will help you to organize your data collection and to focus on potential determinant. When you identify those determinants, if it is a lack of attitude, then perhaps you have to find some approaches for attitudinal change and specific technique for changing attitude. But first, you have to determine what the problem is. If they are not expressing that willingness because they don't have a positive attitude, because they don't know how to do it, because they are facing barriers, you have to determine that.
Yeah, I think
by collecting data.
Okay.
Yeah. So you have to have, let's say, a good, there are tools let's say survey informed by the theory of planned behavior. You can administer those survey, and they have been validated. And after you have administered the survey, you can claim, okay, the reason why they are not performing this behavior is because of this, or this.
Arnaldo, she did interviews.
Yeah. If you want to collect data through interview, so your interview should be structured around the theory. It should be theoretically informed. You are supposed to collect data about barriers, whether or not they are experiencing barrier, whether or not they have a favorable or unfavorable attitude or negative attitude. To be honest with you, this is the level of technicality I don't want to get into, but this is how research is done. So if you say, okay, I want to collect data to determine which factor plays a role in this behavior, and you want to use an interview, I will look at how you frame your question. Because there are specific suggestions about how to ask a question to determine lack of self-efficacy, which is the perceived capability to perform the behavior. So those things should be keep in mind when developing an interview protocol. So for example, self-efficacy, there are two kinds of questions. One question is, how confident are you in? That's the way we word that question. Or how easy is for you to do this and this? So all the things you have to keep in mind when developing your interview protocol.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So there is, somebody asked me something. So one question is, what do you think of changing behavior of people unconsciously via nudging? So I think you know nudging, and how many of you know what nudging is? It's kind of making, I would say, some arrangement that will facilitate the performance of the behavior. Okay. So in many cases, if you use the iterative model of behavioral change, if you remember that behavior are performed, if you are motivated, if you have the skills, and if you can perform the behavior, if there is no major barrier preventing you from performing the behavior. Sometimes nudging, what the nudging does is to remove some barrier. For example, organ donation. In many cases, they realize that people, for taking time to fill out a form became a barrier. And the way they have removed that barrier is that the default option is that unless you express your willingness to not donate, you will not. So let's go back. This is how it is done, and have increased like 50%. So the default option is that you will donate it. If you don't want to donate it, you have to fill out a form stating that you don't want to donate it. So you are kind of nudging people, and you remove a barrier. Sometimes barriers, we think of barrier about major things. Sometimes a barrier is walking a block. That may be a barrier for many people. Fill out a form may be a barrier. And I know in obesity, there is a very interesting study in which they apply nudging. And the study demonstrates that people eat healthier depending on how food are arranged or is arranged in a table. So if fruit and vegetable were close, they will likely eat them. So proximity play a role. And what's the difference between having those vegetable and fruit in the, I would say, in the border of a table compared to in the middle? It makes a difference from a behavioral perspective. They increase the consumption of vegetable and fruit, just changing the arrangement of arrangement of the table. Yes, I think it is a valid approach. I don't think in some cases, it doesn't have anything to do with unconsciousness. It just facilitate the performance of a behavior. That's what nudging is pretty much meant for when it is used in behavioral change.
Good. Yana, do you have questions?
Right now, I'm a little overloaded with all the information. Yeah. Yeah, right now I don't really have anything.
Yeah,
I just
don't
need
feel
to process first.
Yeah. So, for example, qualitative research, I spend a great deal of time teaching about qualitative research. Whatever topic is, take me like 3 hours. Now I'm trying to condense 2 major areas, which are research on behavioral change. So we can spend, I don't know, a course about attitudinal change. Just a course about that.
I can imagine.
And about training. When it comes to research, defining a research question, it seems to be a straightforward thing. Most of the time, people don't formulate question properly. And people mean published authors, experienced researcher, they have issue with defining the focus of research properly. So this is just, I would say, the takeaway and message here is that a lot of things you may be able to use. So you should consult the literature to benefit from theory to guide your intervention, and also a lot of data collection strategy. You don't need to create or develop a survey. There are plenty of surveys that you can use to collect data.
Luisa, do you have questions?
Maybe because you said previously we have to identify what needs to change in order to change it. So if you have multiple things you would change, how do you decide for the one which is the most important to tackle?
So that's a critical question. I think I have a slide about it, but just I did not spend too much time on it. So first of all, you have to identify a behavior, the behavior you want to change. That's what I call the target behavior. And then the second step, you identify what I call behavioral target, the things that you need to change the behavior. And when you collect the data, you may notice that for you to change the behavior, you have to change skills, you may have to change attitude, you may have to increase motivation. So then you are a designer, or you will approach this intervention from something that I read. It was design management approach. Is that correct? Okay, so you may not be able, by using that approach, to change skills, but you may be able to change attitude. And then that will be, you know, based on the data you gather, that attitude is influential. It's one of the determinants of people not performing this behavior. Then that's the one that you will focus on. So behavioral change is about changing things that are relevant and that you can feasibly change. It's like a research. I can do research about, I cannot do research about many things, but I can, or maybe it may be not. So we can do research about many things, but research is not about the things that you can collect data about. Research is about things that are relevant and you can investigate. So, and I will talk about that because one of the I would say the area you have to improve is kind of formulating questions that are relevant and that are achievable. And that's the same with intervention. So you have to target things that are influential and at the same time that you can achieve. Otherwise, what's the point of doing something that you will not be able to do? You don't have the resources. It's not about motivation in many cases. You don't have, I remember in some of the proposal, they were expecting to collect data from CEO. I don't know in Switzerland, there is no way you will recruit a CEO to talk to you for an hour in Canada. They're so busy. So you have to look at, it is not about the things that you desire, it's the things that you can feasibly do.
Linus, do you have a question for Arnaldo?
Maybe yes. Or I think it was already a bit answered, because what I maybe find out that I don't really need to change the behavior of the people because they are actually willing to do so, but it's more supporting them, or they don't know how to. This is then still a behavior change if you support them, right?
Yeah. Coming from pediatric and I did my PhD on childhood obesity, and you know that behavioral change is kind of a process. People go through different steps or phases. At some point they have change, and the idea is to maintain those changes. And you support them at that point in time. It's not about enhancing, you can enhance motivation, but people are already motivated to keep doing what they have been doing. You kind of maintain that support structure, so then they will be able to maintain those behaviors for a prolonged period of time. Yeah, some behavioral change is not about changing anything, just to support changes that have been already made.
Okay.
So if, I don't know, if you have a few more minutes, I can talk a little bit about the proposal. I know this was supposed to be an hour, I guess.
Yes. Jorge,
yes,
what do you
yes,
think?
mean that I have to stop talking, or?
No, it's because we started the meeting with them this morning.
Okay.
So I don't know, Jorge, what do you think? You want to do a poll? You want to?
Oh, something we can do is, the last part of my presentation, I highlight the good things about the proposal that I read and the things that need to be improved. And I
Okay.
provide examples. So if you read those things, you will become aware of some area for improvement.
Do you want, Jorge, you are in mute.
You will share your documentation in that case with us.
Yeah, I would say comments about the proposal are at the last part of my presentation.
Yeah. So
Do you want to go quickly through that, Arnaldo? You want to say these are the good things in the thesis or in the proposals? They are not the thesis.
If you want, I can do it in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah,
Okay, let me show you.
they can go happily to enjoy the weekend.
So I think I already mentioned the good things about the proposals that I read. I think I already mentioned identifying relevant problem. All the problems that were identified were relevant, which is a good thing. And they consulted the literature to support that those problems exist. Let me go. Okay. So those are the main strengths. So things that I think that the student has to work on a little bit is, there are a few things about research in general. Research is not aspirational, as I said here. So it is not like doing things you want to do, all the things you want to do. So we do things that are relevant, but at the same time are achievable. And when I look at some of the research questions, there were too many research questions, too many objectives, too many things that the student wanted to know about. That's impossible. You will not have the resources to do so. So you have to focus on specific things that are relevant and that you can feasibly collect data about and analyze the data.
They might be happy now that they can start crossing some questions.
Or if they read the literature of published papers, they will see people ask very specific questions, very specific issues, and they develop a project to answer those questions. Scientific knowledge and knowledge in general is incremental. There is not something that we do and we will kind of discover everything. That's not how science works. So you have specific questions, you answer, and you move on. So it is not the philosophy of the more the better. So I know, and this is kind of that kind of approach is highly prevalent among the students, that if they have more questions, the research will be better. If they have more variables, the research will be better. Research doesn't operate that way.
Good.
And you don't do research to make a point. I have an example here. You do research to gain knowledge or to address a gap. That's what you do research for. You want to produce new knowledge. That's what it is. Sometimes we have a hypothesis and the data confirm or disconfirm that hypothesis, but it's not done to make a point.
Okay.
So there were some issues about the rationale of the study. So when you, in a research proposal, there are two things you have to focus on. You have to make a case for your study, and you have to provide details about how you will conduct your study. Your method should be sufficiently described. So there were some issues about the rationale for the study that I would say did not fully justify them. So the fact that you identify a relevant problem doesn't fully justify the need for your study.
Okay.
Whereas I have, so if even though they kind of support the existence of problem with some evidence, but I would say the evidence they provide were a little bit weak in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something to pay attention to, and there's different reasons. I highlight those reasons here.
Mm-hmm.
And unclear research objective, I don't blame a student. Faculty, researcher, experienced researcher, they have problem to properly define the focus of research. So this is one way of defining, this is a script for defining objective in qualitative research. You can, and there's an example. This is how a research objective is defined, or should be defined in qualitative research. You see all the components. So I noticed there were some issues about objective and question, and general question and specific question. You see, those things are interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
You always have to you should use a method to guide your research design. And it's quite common. Even you see a lot of papers published, and there's not a method informing that those studies, which is not, it shows that those studies were not properly done. So this has to do with what you have to describe in the meta section. So if you talk about participants, you should describe participants. There's a few things you have to do. You have to describe about data collection, about sampling. I just highlight some of them. If you don't provide information, those who will assess your research proposal will not be sure about the extent to which the study will be done properly. So these are just suggestions about the things you have to explicitly state about sampling, data collection, and data analysis. This is about the writing. There are a few things that I noticed. And at the end, I would say, I think I mentioned at the beginning that you do research to inform, evaluate, and explain behavioral changes. That behavioral change is a process, and I describe the steps. And when it comes to research proposal, there are two things you should focus on. One thing is to make a case for your study, strong case, and properly describe your method.
Okay. Those are good tips for the writing of the thesis. Make a strong case and describe your method. Good.